So our speaker tonight, or it's afternoon here in Washington. It's tonight in Norway. Sorry about the lateness in Norway, but thank you for coming on with us. Jørn Sunde received his doctoral degree in 2007 and became a professor in legal history the same year at the Faculty of Law at the University in Bergen. From 2019, he's a professor at the Faculty of Law at the University in Oslo. 2002 to 2021. He's been a researcher at the museum, Barony Rosendal, since 2019. And since 2019 has also held a position as researcher at the Norwegian National Library. Since 2014, he has headed the Code of 1274 project on legislation and governance in the Middle Ages. And from 2019, he's in the Troika, heading the project on the history of Norwegian policing. Sunde has authored 5 and edited 12 books. He's published over 100 articles, book chapters, and essays, gives about 60 speeches outside of Norwegian universities and appears frequently in Norwegian media and has won awards for his research dissemination. And just to punctuate, in terms of our topic for tonight, Jørn has 2 master's theses and a PhD dissertation on the Barony Rosendal. So we found the right person to help us understand this interesting piece of Norway and also the interesting time that in which it existed. So Jørn, if you want to go ahead and see if the screen sharing works, and we'll get going.
Wonderful. Thank you, Joel. We'll see now if I can make the screen sharing work. So you can now see the slide with the Barony Rosendal on?
Yes.
Good. Let's see. There you go. So thank you very much for the invitation to come and speak of a topic that I love very much. I worked on the history of the Barony Rosendal for many years. I used to work there as a guide when I was a student, and I've later worked there as a researcher and taken great joy in exploring the history of the barony. Now, I don't know if you've heard of the Barony Rosendal before, or if you've heard of any Norwegian nobility at all, because Norway is a country which has not had the same tradition of an aristocracy as you do in the rest of Europe. That doesn't mean that there wasn't an aristocracy in Norway, and I'm going to speak of it today, but it played less of an economic role, less of a political role than it did in other European countries. And when we speak of the Barony Rosendal, we actually speak of the only barony in the history of Norway. So some of you might have traced back your family all the way to the Middle Ages, and if you get back to the end of the 13th century, there might have been a baron in your family, but that were an administrative title. The governors in Norway were named barons from the end of the 1270s till the beginning of the 1300s. But it was just one generation of governors who got the title baron, and the title was abolished already in 1308, and it was never hereditary. So that was the only barons that had ever been in Norway before 1678. When the Barony Rosendal was erected. At that time, there were 3 persons who got a noble title and an estate in Norway. There were 2 counts in the eastern part of Norway. It was the half-brother of the king, Ulrik Fredrik Gyldenløve, who became Count of Laurvigen, south of Oslo, and it was the chancellor in Denmark, Norway, Peder Schumacher, who became Count of Griffenfeld, also south of Oslo. And then it was Ludwig Rosenkrantz, who became the Barony to Rosendal in the western part of Norway. That was it. 3 noblemen, 2 counts, and 1 baron, and those are the only ones in Norwegian history with an hereditary title. The Barony Rosendal was erected in 1678. It lasted till 1821. That does not mean that the state at that time went bankrupt, that it was sold off or anything. It was simply the Norwegian parliament. Norway got its independence in 1814. It became a democratic country. And in 1821, the members of parliament in Norway abolished all nobility in the country by law. Now, Norway was not the first country to do that in Europe. France had done it after the revolution, but Norway was actually the first country to abolish nobility with a lasting effect. It was never reintroduced. So at that time, there were about 250 noble families in Norway, but most of them originated in Denmark. The privileges, the noble privileges, were lost immediately in 1821, but the persons who had a title, like the Baron to Rosendal, could keep his title till his death. In this case, the last Baron to Rosendal died in 1837. Though children who were born before 1821 could keep their title as well, and he had a daughter born 1820, who was the last Baroness of Norway, who died in 1901. But no Baron after 1837, and the last Baroness died in 1901. The estate Rosendal was sold off and the last tenants bought their farms in 1972. Most of the tenants were very reluctant to buy the farms. Sounds very strange, but actually the rent they paid to the barony was not increased after the 1850s, meaning that in the 1970s it was basically nothing that they paid at all. And hence they were much better off as tenants than buying their own farm when they had to pay a market price. So that's why it took quite a long time actually to sell off the barony in the 20th century. So the barony, or the center of the barony, is the Manor House, or at least in Rosendal, it's called the castle. It's not really a castle by size. Each of these two floors are about 300 square meters. And in a European definition, that's a manor house, not a castle. But there are no other private-owned stone houses of this size in this period in Norway, meaning that it was known as a castle in the Norwegian context. It was built by Scottish masons in the 1660s. While the gardeners came from Holland, and I'm mentioning the Scottish masons and the Dutch gardeners deliberately because that's what I'm going to speak of today. This area's connection to the rest of Europe and how this was an area where people were used to traveling, used to receiving foreigners because of trade. And that's also why this area was very wealthy. But before we get to that, let's have a look at the first Baron. This is Ludwig Rosenkrantz. He has portrayed himself very much like the Sun King, Ludwig XIV. And you can even see Versailles at the back here. He never visited France, but anyways, that's how he was. Yes?
I'm not seeing slides advance.
Still seeing the first slide. Joel, you're muted. Yeah.
Yeah. In fact, I'm not seeing. It didn't go into the slideshow presentation. It's still your working screen.
Okay. So let's try again and see if I can make it work. Do you now see? A portrait of two persons?
No.
Still
No.
the title page.
Yes. Okay. Let's see, what I can do is
Jørn, try clicking on 2. This slide 2, because it looks like slide number 1 is highlighted.
there.
Okay, that worked.
Well, yeah.
Okay. I'll
There
try
should be
to.
a slide show along the border there up at the top. One of the, I don't know if that's.
So can you now see persons?
In this kind of a presentation, there's a slideshow that you can click on one of those top ones. I don't. but all right. this is all
I'll
right.
try, but can you see it changing now?
Yes.
Okay, good. It's working. So you have actually not seen the Barony Rosendal before now.
No,
No,
We're still only seeing the presenter view.
we're on
do you
slide
have-
2.
If you have more than one screen, you
Mhm.
might need to do a different kind of sharing where you, when you do advanced sharing, you can decide which screen you want to share.
Let's see. Yeah. I can just, probably it will work if I just do it simple instead of, I'd have to then go in and change the screens. Now you can see the Barony Rosendal. I can just keep it this way.
Then you just go down the left side and click on each slide.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'll just do it like that. I'll make it simple. Sorry about that. So this is the Barony Rosendal. And this is the first Baron, Ludwig Rosenkrantz. And this is his wife, Karen Movat. And by telling about their background today, I hope to give you an insight in the history of the Norwegian gentry, at least in the western part of Norway, which might be of interest if you have relatives within that class of aristocrats below a baron, for instance. And I'm going to also tell you about the Norwegian economy and also how they, by trade, acquired wealth and also access to knowledge and how they were woven with traders and aristocrats in other countries around the North Sea region. I'll start by showing you this picture, this old antique map of Norway. So this is where you have Oslo, Bergen is here, Trondheim is here, and the area where the barony is this area. So so this is this is taken from the map. You can see the Barony Rosendal was situated here. What I wanted to show you are the fjords. When you see the fjords like this, they almost seem like roads. And that's important because the roads, well, you barely had roads in the coastal areas of Norway at that time. People traveled by sea. And the fjords made it possible to transport goods from the inland and out to the coast and up to Bergen, which were a medium-sized trading town in Europe in the Middle Ages and in the 16th and 17th century. This is important because in high mountain areas, inside, or well, where, at the end of the fjords, the high mountain area started. And in those areas, you found a lot of commodities, which found a great market in Europe. So, and we're talking about commodities that we don't think of today, but which were much wanted on the European market in the 17th and 18th century, for instance. One such commodity is falcons. So all since the Middle Ages, since we have written sources, we know that falcons from Norway were sold to the King of England, for instance, the King of France. Even the Sultan of Babylonia received Norwegian falcons. This we know because in 1347, the Pope gave permission to the Norwegians to sell falcons to the Sultan of Babylonia because he did not regard it as supporting the enemy or during a conflict. The Pope was at that time in conflict with the Sultan of Babylonia, but he didn't see any reason to stop the trade with falcons. So falcons were one such commodity. After the Middle Ages, we know that the Dutch were very interested in catching falcons in the Norwegian high mountains. So when Dutch ships came to this area in May to collect timber, they also had falcon hunters with them who would go up in the high mountains in May, And the ships would go back to the Netherlands, come back again in August, September, and then pick up the falcon hunters and bring them back to the Netherlands. And falcons were extremely valuable. One falcon would be a royal gift. So that's one thing that you could catch up in the high mountains. Something else was the short-tailed Weasel, I think it's called, or the ermine, I think you call it. In some parts of Norway, they just called the fur of the short-tailed Weasel for Arabic gold. These were sold to Arabic countries and were very valuable. Again, a commodity in the high mountains that we don't think of today, but which brought wealth to the western part of Norway in the Middle Ages and in the 16th and 17th, and also partly the 18th centuries. Another commodity would be reindeer horn. Reindeer horn has always been much wanted on a European market, and they would hunt reindeers almost industrially. They wouldn't care that much for the meat. It was the reindeer horn that was wanted on the European market and that they would sell off. So the fjords look upon them as roads. And because the western part of Norway has so many fjords, they had easy access to the commodities in the high mountains, and they would sell off to the European market. And that was the basis of the wealth in the western part of Norway. So we can, for instance, see that wealth goes way back from the Hatteberg treasure. Hatteberg treasure is of interest to us because it was found here, right above, Rosendal, back in the 1930s. The Hatteberg treasure, though, consists of about 30 silver and gold items produced in Ireland back in the 10th century. And they're most likely items that they have acquired through trade. And as far as back as we have sources, we know that in the western part of Norway, would trade with the rest of the North Sea region, at least the North Sea region, but even further out to as far away as Asia, actually. Because of this wealth, the western part of Norway and the area where they later built the Barony Rosendal had probably the largest concentration of aristocrats in Norway. There were so many aristocrats because there was so much wealth. There was room for all of them. And they would all, at their estates, gather these different commodities and ship them out to the European market. But there were not only aristocrats in this area where they built the Barony Rosendal later. There were also two monasteries very close on to Rosendal. So if we move back to the map, we had Rosendal in this area. You had one monastery here and one monastery here. These monasteries are two of the largest monasteries in Norway. They had huge amounts of properties. They were so important economically that, for instance, this monastery, this is a painting from the early 17th century, showing the remains of the Halsnøy Kloster monastery. They made a separate trade agreement with the King of England that they could trade lumber with England without paying taxes when they got to an English harbor, for instance. So these monasteries were wealthy, they were large, and there were two of them in the same region, simply because there was so much wealth due to the trade. So that's a bit of the background. So I placed the Barony Rosendal in the western part of Norway in a region which were very wealthy due to trade. And because of that, there were many aristocrats or aristocratic families living in the area. So what I'm going to do now is trace the ancestors to Karen Movat. So this is again the first Baron, Ludwig Rosenkrantz, and his wife, Karen Movat. I'm interested, and what I want to show you is, how these aristocrats in general lived and how they acquired their wealth and how they related to the rest of the North Sea region. Karen Movat is then building the Barony Rosendal together with her husband, Ludwig Rosenkrantz, in the 1660s. Well, let me return to their portraits. She had the wealth. He had the ambitions. He was not wealthy at all, of many different reasons, but he was close to the king. So politically, he was an important figure. She was the richest heir in all of Norway. And they married in 1658, and they started building the Barony Rosendal in 1662. And it was her wealth that financed building the castle Rosendal. So where did that wealth come from? I won't go further back than her grandmother, Else Trons or Else Rustung. She was the daughter of Christopher Rustung or Christopher Trons. He is a fairly well-known figure in Norwegian history because he was an admiral, but an admiral for the archbishop in Norway before the Reformation. With the Reformation, the archbishop had to flee, and he fled to the Netherlands. And the one who was in charge of the archbishop's fleet was Christopher Rustung, who went with the archbishop to the Netherlands. He would actually continue to fight for the archbishop to turn Norway back into a Catholic country for a couple of years. And he offered the Danish king lots of resistance. And the Danish king, but in the end, the fight couldn't be won. The archbishop died. The wealth he had brought with him to the Netherlands would wear out. And the king offered Christopher Rustung to come back to Denmark, Norway, as the king's admiral. And he did. He became the first admiral of the Danish-Norwegian realm and continued his service till he died around 1560. Christopher Rustung is a well-known character because of all his adventures. Some have seen him as a kind of a pirate. He was not. He was an extremely well-educated man. When the archbishop sent an ambassador to the German emperor, he sent Christopher Rustung. So he must have been educated. He must have spoken several languages. We also see that he's in charge of the legal affairs of the archbishop. So probably he had studied law. So he's a very educated man, but he is also a sea captain. And this is very typical for the gentry, the aristocrats from the western part of Norway. They were at sea from they were very young. The reason is these commodities I've been speaking of, like falcons or the fur of the short-tailed weasel or the reindeer horn, or more in the 17th and 18th century or even 16th century lumber, which they sold off to European countries. But in this trade, the aristocrats in the western part of Norway, they were hands-on. That means that they were sailing their ships to the market. So they were not aristocrats sitting at home and having other people doing the trade for them. They were maneuvering the ships themselves. And that is why also they were so able and as sea captains, and were also used in the Danish-Norwegian Navy. But Christopher Rustung, when he got to become the admiral of the Danish-Norwegian realm, he already had quite some properties in the western part of Norway. He got some estates in Denmark as well. So all, I think it was his 9 children, inherited quite some wealth from the father. Else Rustung or Else Trons was one of his, I think it was 8 daughters. He had only 1 son. What is interesting is then her father is this man who is sailing the seas, talking to the German emperor. He's the archbishop's admiral and so forth. While 3 of her sisters spends time at the court of Mary Stuart, the Queen of Scots in Scotland. Her oldest sister, Anna Rustung, is supposedly engaged with the Earl of Bothwell for a while. At least they find that to have been so in a court trial later on. Her two other sisters actually get married in Scotland, most likely. And this says a lot about the aristocrats in the western part of Norway. They were not only engaged in the European market, but they were also engaged with other European aristocrats, and they intermarried. Else Rustung, or Else Trons herself, first married a Norwegian aristocrat. When he died, she married a German aristocrat, and when he died, she married for the third and last time, and this time she married a Scot. And that is very typical. A Norwegian, a German, and a Scot. This is, people from the countries around the North Sea basin, which were trading with each other. But she inherited then wealth from her father. And now I want to talk about her third husband, Andrew Moet. Andrew Moet came from Aberdeenshire in eastern Scotland. He was from a castle that is called Balqually. My pronunciation, the Scots pronounce it quite differently, and I cannot make my tongue perform that pronunciation at all. So I'll just call it Balqually. Sorry. What is interesting is that Andrew Moet's father was called Magnus Moet. He had a Norwegian name. We don't know why, of course, but most likely it was because he was trading with Norwegians. In Aberdeenshire, they would grow a lot of grain, for which there were a large market in Norway, while in Norway, they produced a lot of lumber, for which there were a large market in Scotland. So he might have been one of those trading across the North Sea and then trading with the Norwegian aristocrats. Andrew Moet was not the oldest son. He was actually a quite late son of Magnus Moet. So he wouldn't inherit the estates in Aberdeenshire. So he tried his luck on Shetland. So this is, by the way, this is a picture of the old castle, from the front page of the book, A Lordship Lost. And to your right, you see the modern castle that was built in, I think it was the early 19th century, but at that time the Moets had lost the estate. They went bankrupt in the end. And in the end is the 18th century. Andrew Moet would go to Shetland. Now, Shetland used to be part of the Norwegian realm, but it was mortgaged to Scotland in 1469, and more it became a part of the Scottish realm. And when we get to the 16th century, it was a place where young aristocrats from Scotland could try their luck. And Andrew Moet is one of them, who goes to Shetland and settles in this area in the very northern part of Shetland. Up here, agriculture is very poor, but fisheries are very rich. And there was a large market for fish in Europe at the same time. So what Andrew Moet does is that he engages in what we can call a triangle trade. So he has an estate in the northern part of Shetland where there's an abundance of fish, but you cannot sell that fish in Norway. There's already an abundance of fish in Norway, so there's no point. What he does is that he takes his ships and goes to the Netherlands and sells the ship there. There he buys different commodities like grain, sugar, also salt, because the Dutch salt has higher quality than Norwegian salt. And he takes that up to the western part of Norway, sells it, buys lumber, transport lumber back to Shetland and Scotland, sells it there, and transports fish, etc., in a triangle trade. Hands-on, like the Norwegian aristocrats, Andrew Moet is also hands-on. He's a sea captain, and he sails his own ships, starting from my favorite spot on Shetland here, Sandwich Bay. That's where he always departs from Shetland, going to the Netherlands or to Norway for that matter. We don't know how he met Else Rustung. He could have met her in the western part of Norway because he went there to buy lumber. He could also have met her on Shetland, because as a western part of Norway aristocrat, Else Rustung had quite some properties on Shetland, in this very northern part of Shetland. And she might have been there several times and met Andrew Moet there. We don't know. But what is important to keep in mind is, just like the fjords were roads, the North Sea is a big time highway. So sailing from the western part of Norway to Shetland or Scotland would take less time and be less risky than sailing from the western part of Norway to Oslo. So, and for us, the sea, like the fjords, separate land, and we travel by land. They didn't travel by land, they traveled by sea. And going to Shetland and Scotland were quite natural to them. They could even understand the language they spoke there. So Andrew Moet and Karen Moet, Andrew Moet and Else Rustung might have met in the western part of Norway, or they might have met in Shetland. At least they married. And this is their children. Or their child, sorry, Axel Moet. They have several children, and it's a long story what happens to all of them. It's quite an adventurous family, and they all have their specific and most entertaining history. But I'm going to concentrate on Axel Moet, their oldest son. He has quite a stature, and he was quite a man. In Scottish sources, he was said to be like a viceroy or a vice king of Norway. He was not. He was just incredibly smart and wealthy. That was it. He grew up in the western part of Norway as his father, as his grandfather, Christopher Rustung, the Danish-Norwegian admiral of the realm. He was a sea captain. Sea captains, or being a sea captain, is the way you make your wealth in the western part of Norway in these centuries. As a sea captain, he's trained as a sea captain to perform trade. But as a trained sea captain, he can also do service in the King's Navy. And as his grandfather, Christopher Rustung, he becomes an admiral in the King's fleet. Being an admiral does not pay that well, but the King's favor does. So as an admiral in the fleet, he starts a shipyard and he builds the Navy's fleet or the Navy's ships. And that's how he makes his fortune. Yes, he owns land. Yes, he participates in trade, but through this shipyard and building the Navy ships, he acquires a fortune that he can invest in more land, in more trade, etc., etc. He trades with Shetland, of course, because his half-brothers are living in Shetland. His father, Andrew Moet, came from Shetland, so he trades with his close family on Shetland. He also trades with Scotland because his cousins lives in Scotland. So one of his cousins are Alexander Moet in Edinburgh, which is his trading partner there, for instance. And this is very important because writing a letter, sending it by one ship and waiting to receive it, a reply with another ship, takes a very long time. So to be hands-on, you sail your ship, but if you can't, your own ships, but if you can't, like Axel Moet, who was also engaged as an admiral in the Navy, you're very dependent on trading with close relatives that you can trust, which he did, both in Shetland and in Scotland. And that is how he acquires his wealth. And in one way, he's very typical for the aristocrats in the western part of Norway, in the sense that he's a sea captain, he trades with Scotland, he maneuvers the sea at the North Sea, and this is where he acquires his wealth. In one way, he's different, because also as an admiral and owning this shipyard, he has a steady income that none of the other aristocrats has. And this is also a period when the trade develops and it favors big actors and not small actors. All the aristocrats had been rather small actors. Yes, they make their fortune, but they're not big time actors. Axel Movat is a big actor in any, according to any standard around the North Sea, he's a big actor. And what happens is that by and by, he buys the estates of the small actors, the other aristocrats in the western part of Norway. So when he dies, he has the largest estate in all of Norway. It stretches over an enormous area from Lindesnes in the south to Molde in the north. So that's how, and then we return to Karen Movat. She's his only heir. So she is the heir to this enormous estate and all this wealth. And, I'm sorry, and she marries Ludwig Rosenkrantz. Why on earth would such a wealthy woman marry a rather penniless Danish nobleman? Well, first of all, I think one thing is his political connection with the king, that he was close to the king is the reason why he was made a baron, and he had political connections, which would be important to her father. Yes, he's wealthy, but he's in Norway and he is not close to the king, and having a son-in-law which has that relationship to the king can also be very favorable to trade. But there's probably another reason. I'm going to skip some slides because I'm running out of time. So this is actually where Ludwig Rosenkrantz grew up. He didn't grow up in Denmark. He grew up at Buckenhorst Manor in the Netherlands. And next to Scotland, the Netherlands was a very important trading partner for Norway. And what Axel Movat had was connections. He had half-brothers on Shetland. He had cousins in Scotland, but he had absolutely no relatives in the Netherlands. And if you can't do trade hands-on, as I said, you want to have trading partners that you can rely on. And if you don't have family members in the Netherlands, you get it if your son-in-law is in the Netherlands or grew up in the Netherlands. And this is the Zuilen Castle. Is not far from Utrecht in the Netherlands, where Ludwig Rosenkrantz's brother lived. So what in this marriage is for Ludwig Rosenkrantz enormous amount of wealth, for Karen Movat, or at least her father, somebody with political connections and who has family members in the Netherlands, which is an important trading partner. So this might be one of the reasons why they married, and I'm sorry, by that marriage, got to build the Barony Rosendal. Now, I have portrayed their marriage very logically. She is wealthy, he has political connections and family in the Netherlands. So it's a good match. Usually that is how we reason about a marriage when we don't have other sources. In this case, we do. It is very rare that we have private letters between spouses in Norway in the 17th century. But in this case, we do. Because Karen Movat wrote and Ludwig Rosenkrantz wrote letters to each other because he went to Copenhagen. That happens the summer of 1662. And the summer of 1662, 1663, and 1664, he is in Copenhagen. He is in Copenhagen to persuade the king to give him a post in Denmark, and he wants them to sell off his estates in Norway and buy estates in Denmark and move with his own whole family, his wife, and at this time 3 children, to Denmark. She does not want to move. She stays in Norway. And their letters is very much about this dispute. He tries to make her come to Copenhagen. He tells her about all the beautiful jewelry she can buy there. She he writes about the beautiful dresses she can get in Copenhagen. He really tries to lure her off to Copenhagen. She writes, at one time, she writes, "You fool, this is way too expensive. You're wasting our money. Come back and run the estate. My father made his fortune by hands-on policy. Come back and do the same thing." It's very interesting that she refuses to listen to her husband. And by all means, she's also right. By him staying in Copenhagen each summer for 3 years in a row, spending so much money to get the king's attention, he's wasting their fortune. What is even more interesting is that this is when they're building the castle. So building the castle the summer of 1662, and they continue with the masonry till 1666. For the first 3 summers, he's away. And you do masonry of this kind in Norway at this time only during the spring, summer, and early fall. You do not do it during the winter. That's the time period when Ludwig Rosenkrantz is in Copenhagen. She has an idea of how to run an estate. She wants her husband to run it like her father did. Well, she actually knows how to run an estate because she's the one running it. She's not only running an estate, she's running the building of this castle. There has to have been several hundred people working on the masonry during the summer. And she's the one who pays off the wages, makes sure that they get their food, take care of their families, make sure they have lodging, etc., etc. Or she's doing this together with her half-brother. Moet has one daughter, Moet, which I've been speaking of, his only heir, but he has also another child. He had an illegitimate son born outside wedlock before he married his wife, Karen Bilt. His son is called Anders, after his father, Andrew, and he got at least some education, we know, because he can read and write, and he can do accounting. He has status because he marries a German noblewoman, again, aristocrat from Germany. Germany, Norway, the Netherlands, Scotland, all these countries around the North Sea that trade with each other, where they have connections, they also marry with each other. So Anders Helvig, the illegitimate son of Axel Moet, marries a German aristocrat. He participates in the lumber trade like his father, because his father gives him a small estate where there's a sawmill, there's a large forest, and he sells timber to countries abroad. His illegitimate son has a close relationship to his sister, and it might have been that he assisted her when they were building the castle, and her husband was not assisting her. He was in Copenhagen. In 1664, he gives up. The king doesn't want to give him a post in Denmark. Why should he? He has a lot of able civil servants in Denmark. He wants Ludwig Rosenkrantz to stay in Norway. And he comes back and he starts running his estate. And he starts doing as his wife tells him to do. And it becomes very successful because she has a sound mind for business. And it becomes prosperous again. And that's when it becomes a barony in 1678, the first and only barony in the history of Norway. And to a large extent, this is due to her wife's wealth, a wealth acquired the same way as aristocrats in the western part of Norway had always acquired their wealth, through trade across the North Sea. The difference was that the time favored big actors, and her father became one of the aristocrats that became a big actor and actually consumed many of the small actors and became the dominant trader in the western part of Norway, so wealthy that, as I said, they regarded him as a viceroy in Norway, a vice king in Norway. So in many ways, the history of the Barony Rosendal is unique. It's the only barony in the history of Norway. It's not unique in the sense that it is situated in an area of Norway which has a long history of trade, a long history of aristocrats, not of barons, but of a gentry below the social status of a baron. So in that sense, the barony is exceptional, but the history of the Barony Rosendal also shows us some of, I would say, the general history of at least the western part of Norway, which was so heavily engaged with trade with the rest of Northern Europe. So, Joel, I think that was it. I kind of scheduled that I would speak for 45 minutes, and I think I spoke for 50. I hope that is okay. And I would be delighted if there's any questions or comments or reflections.
Well, first of all, let me thank you very much. That was very, very informative. I learned. I think I mentioned in one of my emails that Christopher Tronson was one of the reasons that I got interested in genealogy. But I learned a lot more about him just from your brief mentions of him here than I ever knew. So I have a lot more work to do to track him down. And I understand you're actually working on trying to flesh out more information about this guy. Look, but before we get into my personal questions, one of the things that I found interesting when I was looking into a lot of the farms around that area, and I actually looked into some of the Rosendal records that were online. I think they've been moved to a different location, so they're a little harder to find. But I was interested in the ownership system. So I take it that a lot of the farms that Karen had were part of the barony, and that so then they paid rents, but then over time they started to be sold or to break away, or I don't quite understand how some of that.
Yes, when Karen and Ludwig married, she had approximately 500 farms. That was her estate. What they did was that they split it in two parts. So half of it became the Barony Rosendal. A barony cannot be sold off. It cannot go bankrupt. However much debt a baron has, his estate is going to remain intact. So that's a great privilege. The problem is, of course, that even though your property cannot be confiscated by a creditor, you can also not sell it. So if you're in need of cash, what do? Well, that's what this other half is about. So they split it in two. One half is the Barony Rosendal, which becomes a kind of a tied up property. The other half is the Baron's private property that he can sell off, but that can also be pawned and, or mortgaged and confiscated by creditors. But that's the kind of property he needs to get cash. Then he sells properties and he buys properties when he has surplus cash, etc., etc. This property moves around till around 1755. That's when it's all sold off of different reasons. The Barony Rosendal cannot be sold till the Norwegian Parliament makes a special statute in 1888. And from that time on, farmers can buy the property. They don't. The first farm is sold in 1909. And the rest of the farms is not sold till later, because when in 1927, a member of the family simply gives the entire estate to the university in Oslo. So it becomes the property of the university, and the university is not very keen on administrating a big estate, the largest estate in Norway at the time. So they sell off the properties fairly cheap. They build dormitories, student dormitories for the income. And by 1972, all properties that were the original barony estate are sold off.
Interesting.
If these properties are individual farms that are spread out over a pretty good sized area, it seems like there's a huge amount of administration problems and logistics and things like that to keep it financially intact.
Yes, it is. The Baron had 6 deputies spread around on the estate, each taking care of 1/6 of the total estate, but at the same time, he put a lot of effort in keeping the estate as close to the manor house as possible. So the 250 farms approximately that was the barony was the farms that were closest to the manor house. So he wouldn't have such an administrative expense. But he still needed 6 deputies to administrate that part of his property. The other 250, excuse me, farms were spread much more out. And he needed several deputies also to keep track on what was going on those farms. And this was extremely important because one of the commodities that he could sell off to a European market in the 17th century is lumber. But it is, of course, a great temptation for the tenants to cut down lumber and sell it off themselves without the Baron noticing. So that's why he needed deputies to keep control on the use of his forests.
I was curious for the falconry, how did they use them to hunt? Did they train the falcons to hunt for them?
Yes.
And do weasels still exist today, and the horned reindeer still exist today?
Both exist today, but they're no commodity, and falcons are not a commodity anymore either. But falcons were used for hunting. The fur of the short-tailed weasel was used for well, aristocrats and also royals would use that white winter fur to make clothing. So it was the most expensive, most extravagant clothing that you could come up with. The reindeer's horns were used for several things. One of the interesting things is that they used them to make combs, and I don't know why, to comb your hair. And there's a very long tradition. If you go to ancient Rome, the Romans used to also use combs made by reindeer horn. And hopefully someday somebody can explain to me why. I don't know the difference between a deer's horn and a reindeer's horn and why reindeer horns are so much more attractive. But obviously, maybe just simply because they were reindeer horns, that, rare. I don't know.
Thank you.
Well, it's a different picture than we usually have of Norway in those times. Much wealthier, I think, than most of us thought.
That's also because what happens in the 19th century when you have most of the immigration is 2 things. There is no longer a European market for these different commodities. So the industrialization of Europe have changed the market dramatically. So that's one thing. There's no more lumber to be cut down and sold because it's all sold off. When you get to the midst of the 18th century, there's hardly any forests left in the western part of Norway. It's all sold off. And also you have the population increase. There's a dramatic population increase in the 19th century. So the story I've told is the story up till about 750, and then things start to change. And then 100 years later, you have the Norway that you all have an image of, and that's the Norway which sends off immigrants to, for instance, the US.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I have a question. The family name for the Baron seemed to be Rosenkrantz. Now, was he associated with the Rosenkrantz Tower in Bergen? And I guess that was built by the governor, whose name was Rosenkrantz.
That's right. That's right. Yes, that's not in a direct line, but he's a member of that fairly large Danish noble family. And Erik Rosenkrantz, who built the Rosenkrantz Tower, would be a distant relative of him. Yes.
But the reason I ask is that my ancestor, who lived in an area of Vestnes, there across from Molde. Well, we visited him, and he asked if we wanted to see his license. And he pulls out this thing that looks like the Declaration of Independence. And it's a license for a sawmill.
Yes.
And it's signed, on the bottom, Rosencrantz. I mean, in big letters, Rosencrantz. And then in kind of tiny letters, I think it was like Christian or something like that. That would be the King of Denmark, So, so that was a license for the sawmill. And he says, "Well, I have another license." And well, this is a license to export. No, and I think that there it was actually signed by Karl Johan, the king, of Norway.
Okay.
So, but that was interesting. Now then I asked, well, where is the sawmill? And well, there's what we would call it a little draw, or creek or something, and there seemed to be kind of a shack there with the saw in it or something like that, and that was the sawmill. But nevertheless, it had these very impressive licenses.
Very interesting.
Yes, these sawmills were very, very valuable back in this would then be a license from the 16th century, I guess. So in the 16th and 17th centuries, these sawmills were very valuable.
Well, the export license seemed to be from the period after 1800,
Yeah, well, Karl Johan died in 1842, so yes, definitely.
Yeah.
So I have a question about the modern Norway. You explained at the beginning of the talk that the parliament abolished the nobility, retained a constitutional monarchy, and a couple times I've heard references to the current Queen Sonia's, her engagement with the king was controversial because she was a commoner. And similarly, I've seen comments that the current crown princess was a commoner. What option would there be to not be a commoner unless you marry a non-Norwegian?
There would be a few options. That's because there's still 19 Norwegian families that are Danish aristocrats. So in 1821, all the families that were Norwegian noblemen would also be Danish noblemen. And most of them just gave up the whole status as an aristocrat. There were no privileges that came along with it anymore, so why should they care? But 19 families held on to their status as a Danish nobleman and still do today. So there's a few, but they would appear very much as commoners as well, I must admit. And hence, no, there wouldn't be hardly any other option than marrying a commoner in Norway today, unless you marry a royal from some of the other royal families in Europe. That's quite true, yes.
Could you please talk about that Magnus that you spoke of that was a Scotsman?
Yes.
I didn't catch all that.
We don't know much about Magnus. We know that he is a Scottish nobleman. The Moet family came originally from Normandy to England in 1066, and one branch of the family went to Wales, one branch of the family went to Scotland, and it is the Scottish branch of the family that ends up in Norway. Magnus is just a part of the Moet family in Scotland, which didn't actually pronounce their name Moet, but Moet. And the branch of the family that settled in Aberdeenshire. Aberdeenshire is in northeastern Scotland, and is a very interesting area because it's the area in Scotland which has the largest number of aristocrats, just like the western part of Norway, and very much of the same reason. They traded. So each aristocrat doesn't possess a lot of land, but he possesses land which produces a commodity that you can sell abroad. And in this case, it's grain, because Aberdeenshire is east of the Highlands. And that means that they just get the perfect amount of drizzle. So that is perfect for growing grain, actually. So the land they possessed were not necessarily very large, but it had an enormous production capacity. And they exported this grain to Norway, but also to the Netherlands and the rest of the European continent. And since he was called Magnus, which is a Norwegian name, the name Magnus doesn't, actually Magnus isn't a name at all. It is Latin, and it means great. And it was taken on as a man's name in Norway back around year 1000. And it's only used in Norway and on Iceland, and not in Denmark, and not in Sweden even. And so when he was called Magnus Moet, it must have been because he traded with Norway, I reckon. At least we know that the branch of the family that settled on Shetland would trade with Norway, and I guess he did as well.
That's interesting that they originated in Normandy. So that's sort of full circle coming back to Norway eventually. Huh?
That's right. That's right. They were called Monte Alto.
Mm.
Would tenants that were tempted to, say, cut down timber and do a little trading, would they have had the wherewithal, enough wealth to have their own boat or ship and actually get to Scotland or Shetland back and forth?
Yeah, this is one of the questions I would love to be able to answer, and I can't. On one hand, we know it was an immense problem for the taxing authorities that the boats that went back and forth between Norway and Scotland, the large boats were easy to detect, and you could tax their cargo. But the taxing authorities complained that there were so many small boats going back and forth. And each time they stopped a boat, they would always claim that they were just visiting relatives, which was probably also true. The whole truth would probably be that they traded with relatives. And so they would cheat on the taxing authorities and sail small boats. And this is people that are used to trade. So I've been talking about the aristocrats today because the aristocrats, they leave documents. But I would assume that on a much lower level, you would have very small scale trading, but still trading between farmers in the western part of Norway and farmers on Shetland and in Scotland.
Does the name Sanderson, is that ever come up in this theater?
Yes, several times, because the thing is that it is sometimes hard to detect the Scots that settles in the western part of Norway, because quite some Scots do, not necessarily aristocrats, but, sailors who've been on the boats. They settle down and they marry in the western part of Norway. We can only trace them by their names. Sunder would be a typical Scots name. So when I meet a Sunder in the sources, I would guess that he might have been a Scot or a descendant of a Scot. But a specific Sanderson, I can't remember, but I've met several Sanders. Yes, I have.
So there are a lot to choose from then. It's not
a lot, but there's some, yes, definitely. So Sander, Robert, Cecilia, they're usually Scots or descendants of Scots, to mention a few names. David, William would be others, but William can also be Dutch.
This is interesting. It's part of my family comes from the Christian Trons and his daughter down that line. One of my branches is
okay.
So it's interesting. Thank you.
Yes.
Along those lines, and Alan is some kind of a cousin. We haven't quite figured out exactly, but one of the reasons I got interested in this was that Christopher Tronson was at the top of the family tree for both my grandmother and my grandfather through different daughters. So I thought that was kind of interesting until I was looking online and found a posting by another guy, Christopher Oa, who has written some interesting articles. He said, "Oh yeah, I'm related to 4 of the daughters." So those 8 daughters generated a lot of family in that part of Norway.
That's quite true. That's quite true. Yes.
That find, the Hitteberg find that you showed a
Yeah.
slide of, you
Yeah.
said that those items were made in Ireland. How do you know that?
Well, it's the archaeologist, of course, who claims that, and that's due to the specific Celtic patterns that you have. It's Celtic production, so it's their style of decorating silver and gold that you find on the different items.
Was there such a thing as a Viking style then, or was it just sort of a intermarried, combination thing?
Oh no, there's definitely a Viking style as well. So each of these population groups had their own styles, but they also exchange goods. And obviously they have then, of course, they could have been plundering. We can never know for sure how they got these items to Hatteberg, but what we do find also in this area, when you actually look at the DNA, is that there's a lot of Celtic DNA in the western part of Norway. And most likely there were a lot of interconnections, peaceful interconnections, next to the rights, of course.
Well, I have to say that this has been very, very interesting. Thank you very much for agreeing to meet with us. And
Absolutely. It really
I have
was.
one quick question. Are there published genealogies of the royals?
The Norwegian royals, present Norwegian royals,
Yes.
I wouldn't know. Probably there is, but I'm sorry, I wouldn't know.
Okay, thank you.
yeah, Alan has a copy of the extremely interesting account of the Moet.
It's in English for everybody to know, and I got mine through the museum in Shetland online.
Yeah,
I
I
don't
mean,
know if there are other ways to get it.
What's the
Great.
title?
It's a great book.
Can you put it in the chat?
read the title.
It's a long title. From a Shetland lordship to a Norwegian barony, the Moet family and the Barony of Rosendal. It's a great book. The Shetland Museum and Archives sells it online.
It was the Jørn, it was the first memorial lecture at that museum for somebody.
For Tom Henderson, that's right, that's right. And it was also a great pleasure writing that article, because I went to Shetland and I visited absolutely every spot on the islands where there had been a Moet in the 17th and 16th and 17th century. So it was very interesting research, also seeing the places.
Yeah, I liked your story about the laird who wasn't so friendly.
Well, he chased me away with a shotgun. It turns out that trespassing is a crime in many countries. You see, in Norway it isn't, because you can walk around in, as long as you're not walking in people's fields during the summer season, you can walk on people's property, not close to houses. And I wanted to see where the Moets had been and what kind of land they possessed, etc., etc. So I went walking around, and suddenly there was this guy with a shotgun who asked me what I was doing trespassing his grounds. And he gave me 20 minutes to leave it. So sometimes research can be risky.
There's different kinds of risk, I guess.
That's true.
Okay, thanks, Alan, for posting that title. And I can, when I send out the notice for the next meeting, I'll send the link for this meeting, and I'll also include that reference if you're interested.
Sounds good.
I learned something new. Thank you so much.
Mhm.
Learned a
Thank
lot.
you very much for having me. It's been a great pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.
Very unique information. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
One of the things that I've said, we have a Norwegian history roundtable that meets monthly also. And they have some very, very interesting presentations as well. But when we start talking about Norwegian history, it seems like we talk about the Vikings and we talk about World War II. And there's 1,000 years in between there. So there were interesting things going on in between, I think.
That's true.
Okay, so again, I'll send out the notice for the next meeting. We'll meet in about a month. And we'll try to look at some less common ways of tracking down information about our ancestors with Alexis Steen.
I have one more question. Is
Go ahead.
everyone got? I was just wondering about, occasionally I'll run into a status of someone called a soldier, you know, in the 16th century, 17th century. Well, what exactly does that mean? Who are they working for? What are they doing if there's not a war going on?
Yeah.
That's their title as a soldier, and they come from, you know, just an average farm somewhere.
Yeah. First of all, it means that they're enlisted, and if there is a war, they have to join the army immediately. So that's the essence. What is important is that once you're a soldier, you're no longer under military jurisdiction, and that has some advantages. At the same time as it has some advantages tax-wise to be enlisted as a soldier. So being a soldier, well, almost 1/3 of all Norwegians, at least in the beginning of the 18th century, were enlisted at any given time. And as I said, for the king, the advantage is that he has soldiers that must muster if there is a war. For the soldier is a privilege. Well, you have some tax advantages and you have the privilege of being under military jurisdiction. That doesn't sound fun. But the thing is, if you get a child outside wedlock and you're enlisted as a soldier, you don't have to pay a fine. Not the first time and not the second time, not before the third time. And that is a privilege that some young man found attractive.
So in the meantime, you could be a farmer or
Yes.
Okay.
You stayed at your home. Yeah.
Okay.
At least once a year, you had to meet with the captain of your company. You had to show him your arms, that they were all in order. You had to do some marching for a couple of days, and you would be sent home again.
So it's like the National Guard here, or the people
Pretty
that work
much.
in the state. Remember the people that are enlisted in the state and they go off for a weekend to practice, and that's what it sounds like.
Yeah.
Some type of situation.
Hmm.
It's pretty interesting. Okay. There's no more questions. Let's thank Jørn again for terrific presentation.
So much.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
Many thanks. A wonderful program.
Absolutely.
I'm gonna wanted to say hello to Tona. Thank you for joining us. And as I said, thank you for making this connection. You're the reason that we were able to get this speaker. So we appreciate that very much. And I think you're on mute.
There. I'm so sorry I was late. I miscalculated all the time. I thought I was early, but I came late. Sorry. But Jørn, do you know my connection to you?
No,
No.
we met.
Yeah, we met. I watched your lectures several times and I enjoy it very much. And but I thought I should say that your father built the house of my sister.
Okay.
You know Åse Myklebust and Endre Nese?
Ah, yes, of course.
She's my sister. And I think I've been to your home.
You probably have.
89, I think.
Probably.
So
I did
followed you.
Give my love to Åse. I haven't seen her for a couple of years now, but you know, yeah, she was a great friend of our family.
Yes, yes. Okay. I'm so glad you would do this. I enjoyed it.
It was
And
my
I have
pleasure.
to see it once more, I think.
Yeah, it'll be available. And congratulations on retirement.
Thank you. Now I start working.
Now life gets interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so without further
Jørn,
ado,
you will do a new thing at the Barony next summer? in August?
I don't know yet. We'll see. We'll see. I've been a little bit reluctant in general to take on any making any speeches at all because of a project I'm heading, which is ending this summer, and it's a lot of work, you know, preparing all the reports and stuff. But if it's not going to be this fall, it's going to be soon anyway.
I'm looking forward to.
Thank you.
is that the project you mentioned in your email?
Well, I'm at I have no, probably not. It's a center on medieval history at. I'm sorry, it's a project on medieval history at the Center for Advanced Studies in Oslo. So that's what I'm completing right now.
But you also have the project to translate.
Yeah.
Okay. I'll look forward to it.
Okay, but then thank you very much and bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you. I'm going to hit the end button here.